Forgiveness is one of the most praised ideas in conversations about healing. It's spoken about with a kind of certainty, as if it's a natural destination for anyone who wants to move forward. We hear it in advice from well-meaning friends, in spiritual teachings, in therapy language, in family conversations after something painful has happened. Forgiveness will set you free. You'll feel lighter once you forgive. You have to let go so you can heal. Over time, those messages start to shape how people understand recovery from harm. They create the impression that forgiveness is the evidence that healing has happened. But what's rarely discussed is the complexity behind that idea, because forgiveness can mean very different things depending on who is speaking. For some people, it means releasing resentment internally. For others, it means restoring a relationship. For others, it means spiritual peace. Those differences are often blurred together. And when they are, forgiveness can begin to function less like personal choice and more like social expectation. Something that helps restore comfort. Something that helps people move past difficult conversations. Something that signals that the situation has been resolved. The problem is that resolution doesn't always mean repair. Harm can still exist. Patterns can still be active. Accountability can still be missing. And when forgiveness becomes the focus before those things are addressed, something important gets lost. The conversation shifts away from the behavior that caused the damage and toward the emotional response of the person who experienced it. Instead of asking what needs to change, the attention turns to how quickly someone can move on. Today's episode reflects on the tension between forgiveness and accountability, and what it can look like to heal while still telling the truth about what happened. This is Born Tired, where survival meets healing, a podcast for those of us who grew up in survival mode but are ready to heal and speak our truth. I'm Irene, a cycle breaker learning what peace feels like after years of survival. Every episode is an invitation to rest inside your truth, to feel seen, and to remember you were never alone. This is what it sounds like when silence finally breaks. Before we begin, I want to share a gentle reminder. This episode includes reflections on family trauma, abuse, and the pressure to forgive before accountability has happened. Please listen in a way that feels safe for you. If at any point you need to pause or step away, honor that. Your well-being matters more than finishing the episode. You are not alone. Take care of yourself while you listen. Forgiveness kept appearing in my life as an expectation. Not something that unfolded on its own time, but something I was supposed to reach in order to be seen as healed. It was framed as growth, as peace, as evidence that I had moved on. What went mostly unexamined was whether the behavior had changed, whether accountability had happened, whether the conditions that caused the harm were still in place. Forgiveness seemed to arrive faster than honesty, faster than repair, and faster than safety. And each time it did, I felt a quiet pressure to smooth things over, to stay positive, to carry the emotional weight so everyone else could remain comfortable. That pressure taught me something important. How easily forgiveness can be used to bypass truth when truth feels inconvenient. Forgiveness, for me, arrived through other people. Through conversations that followed moments where I had tried to name harm, confusion, or pain. What struck me wasn't just how often forgiveness was mentioned, but how quickly it appeared almost reflexively. As if the moment something difficult was spoken out loud, forgiveness became the solution that allowed everyone else to exhale. There were times when I was told that forgiveness had already happened, not by me, but by others. And once forgiveness had been declared, the expectation was that I would fall in line with it, that I would move forward, soften my stance, and re-enter relationships as if the past no longer mattered. The problem was that behavior hadn't changed. The unhealthy patterns were still there. I was being asked to forgive while still being spoken to in ways that felt dismissive, critical, and harmful. Forgiveness was framed as progress, but what it required of me was silence, acceptance, and endurance. In those moments, forgiveness felt constricting, like something I was supposed to perform in order to be considered healed. In other instances, reconciliation became the focus. There was a strong emphasis on keeping the family together, maintaining connection, preserving appearances. Repair was implied but never actually discussed. Change was assumed but never demonstrated. The responsibility to make things work fell on me, on my capacity to understand, on my willingness to let things go, on my ability to stay regulated in environments that continue to feel unsafe. I was expected to absorb discomfort quietly so that others wouldn't have to sit with it at all. There were also moments when positivity took center stage, a preference for good energy, for lightness, for moving on without looking back. Anything that disrupted that tone was treated as unnecessary negativity. Bringing up the past was seen as dwelling. Naming harm was seen as holding a grudge. The message was subtle but consistent. If I wanted connection, I needed to stay pleasant. If I wanted peace, I needed to stay quiet. Over time, that expectation did something to me. I began questioning whether my reactions were excessive, whether my boundaries were reasonable, whether my unwillingness to forgive on demand meant something was wrong with me. I was often told that forgiveness was for me, not for them, that holding on to anger only hurt me, that letting go was the path to freedom. But what no one seemed willing to acknowledge was that I wasn't holding on to anger. I was holding on to truth. There were experiences in my life that crossed lines, experiences that caused real harm. And forgiving those experiences, not in theory but in practice, felt like asking myself to deny their impact. In some situations, forgiveness felt less like healing and more like betrayal. A betrayal of my younger self, of my body's memory, of the clarity I had fought so hard to reclaim. I wasn't refusing forgiveness out of bitterness. I was refusing it because I needed to stay aligned with myself. I think one of the hardest parts for people like me is that we can see the full picture. We can connect the dots. We can understand that this person behaves this way because of what happened to them. We can see the wounds underneath the harm. But empathy can start to blur things when it keeps placing you in situations that cause you harm, where your understanding begins to outweigh your own sense of safety. Understanding someone's trauma does not erase the impact of what they did. It does not make the abuse less abusive, and it does not mean you are required to stay in harm's way just because you understand where it came from. What I began to understand was that forgiveness had become a shortcut, a way to avoid discomfort, to bypass accountability, a way to restore normalcy without addressing what had made things unsafe in the first place. And each time forgiveness was offered prematurely, something in me tightened. I could feel the cost of moving forward too quickly. The cost was my integrity, my ability to trust my own experience. It's something that I came to realize slowly across different relationships and different moments. But the pattern was unmistakable. Forgiveness was being asked of me as proof of growth. What I needed was permission to tell the truth without being rushed toward a resolution. What I started to notice over time was that forgiveness was rarely talked about as something personal or internal. It showed up more like a social expectation, something that helped smooth things over, something that helped people move forward without too much disruption. It felt like a way to restore order, to get back to something familiar, even if the normal had always depended on someone caring more than they should have. One of the moments that crystallized this for me was one of the last conversations I had with my father. He demanded I apologize to my sister. Not just apologize, but beg for her forgiveness. There was something surreal about that moment. After everything I had lived through, after the years of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, after surviving environments where harm was constant and protection was absent, I was being told that I was the one who needed to ask for forgiveness. Not for causing harm, but for how I coped with the abuse I had endured, for the ways I protected myself, for the ways I spoke up, for the ways I finally stopped absorbing everything. The irony was impossible to ignore. The people who caused the damage were never asked to repair it. The systems that enabled the abuse were never questioned. But I was expected to humble myself, to make peace, to restore the balance by taking responsibility for the fallout of what had been done to me. In that moment, forgiveness was about obedience, about returning to my place, smoothing over discomfort so others wouldn't have to confront what had actually happened. And I remember realizing something very clearly. If forgiveness required me to deny my reality, then it wasn't freedom. It was erasure. I was being asked to abandon the truth. In many of the spaces I moved through, forgiveness was treated as proof of maturity. The faster you forgave, the more healed you were assumed to be. What I didn't hear much curiosity about was who was being asked to forgive, or who benefited when forgiveness happened quickly. More often than not, the expectation landed on the person who had already adapted the most, the person who could stay regulated, the person who could reflect, the one who could absorb discomfort without disrupting the system. Over time, I noticed how easily forgiveness replaced accountability. Once forgiveness entered the conversation, change stopped being urgent. The focus shifted away from behavior and focused solely on my response. If I was still affected, it meant I hadn't forgiven enough. If I needed distance, it was read as resentment rather than self-awareness. I also noticed how often forgiveness language was wrapped in spiritual and self-help terms. They sounded expansive, but were often used to limit what could be named. Healing was expected to look calm, light, and unbothered. Anything that disrupted that image was treated as regression. What that misses is how healing actually works. Healing isn't linear. It isn't always peaceful. It includes anger that doesn't resolve neatly, grief that resurfaces after long periods of quiet, and clarity that doesn't always restore closeness, but instead redraws boundaries. I also came to understand that people often mean very different things when they talk about forgiveness. When forgiveness is assumed to mean renewed access, the cost rises. It stops being an internal process and becomes a condition for connection, a way to prove that the past no longer matters. But the past does matter when it's still present in tone, behavior, and pattern. Forgiveness can't erase that without consequence. And the consequence is often internal. Parts of yourself being pushed aside so the relationship can remain intact. Eventually, I understood that my hesitation around forgiveness wasn't unwillingness. It was discernment. An awareness that moving too quickly would cost me clarity I had fought hard to regain. For me, healing has not been about forcing forgiveness. It has been about acceptance. Acceptance of the reality that no matter what I say, no matter how clearly I explain, no matter how much love or empathy I bring into the situation, I cannot change people who do not want to change. It has also meant accepting what happened to me, accepting that I can't go back and make my childhood different. I can't rewrite those years. I can't undo the pain. That acceptance does not mean those things were okay. It doesn't mean they were less harmful. It simply means I stopped arguing with reality. I stopped waiting for the past to become something other than what it was. And in doing that, I made more room for the truth. There's a difference between releasing anger and releasing truth. Those differences aren't talked about enough, especially when preserving the relationship is treated as more important than staying true to yourself. Forgiveness is often framed as the end goal of healing. But for many people, healing begins earlier than that, with orientation, with trusting your perception again, with being allowed to name harm without being rushed toward resolution. When forgiveness is demanded too early, it interrupts that process. It turns healing into a moral performance, something that has to look right instead of feel honest. What I needed, and what I think many people need, is permission. Permission to let healing unfold without a predetermined ending. Permission to decide what forgiveness means or whether it belongs at all. Permission to choose internal alignment over external approval. This isn't about rejecting forgiveness outright. It's about returning agency to the person who carries the impact. Because forgiveness under pressure is not the same as forgiveness freely chosen. And healing shaped by obligation always comes with a cost. As I sit with everything I've shared, the thing that feels most important to name is this: healing is not a performance, and it's not something you owe to anyone else's timeline. Healing doesn't exist to make relationships more comfortable. It doesn't exist to smooth things over or resolve tension on demand. Healing exists so you can come back to yourself, so your thoughts, your emotions, and your body can begin to move in the same direction again. For a long time, I believed healing meant being unaffected. That if something still hurt, I hadn't done enough work. That if I still needed distance, I must be holding on to something I should have released by now. Those beliefs didn't come from inside me. They were absorbed over time, from culture, from spirituality, from relationships that rewarded calm and forgiveness more than honesty and safety. What I've learned instead is that healing often looks like staying close to reality, not escaping it. It looks like letting things remain complicated, letting grief exist without rushing it away, letting anger point you toward a boundary, accepting that clarity doesn't always bring people closer, and that doesn't mean it's wrong. When forgiveness shows up in that process, it has to arrive in its own timeline, not as a requirement, not as proof of growth, not as something you perform to be seen as healed. It has to come from safety. There are things in my life I've forgiven quietly, without ceremony, because my body no longer reacts. And there are other things I haven't forgiven, because their impact still matters. Choosing not to forgive in certain situations doesn't mean choosing bitterness. Sometimes it means choosing accuracy. Sometimes it means choosing self-respect. Sometimes it means acknowledging that a line was crossed in a way that permanently changed what connection could look like. Some experiences change us. They leave marks. They shape what we can tolerate. Healing doesn't erase those changes. It helps us live with them without losing ourselves. I also want to name the strength it takes to resist pressure to move before you're ready, to trust yourself when others suggest you should be lighter, calmer, more forgiving by now. That resistance is often protection. Peace that depends on denial is fragile. It takes constant effort to maintain. Real peace, the kind you feel in your body, is built on clarity, on trusting your own experience, on responding to life as it actually is, not how it's supposed to be for the sake of harmony. If forgiveness is part of your healing, I hope it finds you without pressure. And if it isn't, I hope you know healing is still possible. There isn't one correct sequence. There isn't one required outcome. Forgiveness does not outrank safety. Connection does not outrank self-trust. What matters is orientation. Whether you're allowed to believe what you experience, whether your choices reduce harm, especially harm toward yourself. I've learned that integrity in healing is vital. It doesn't ask for validation. It simply stops participating in what causes internal damage. It chooses alignment over approval, even when that choice is misunderstood. That choice can feel lonely. It can change relationships. But it also creates space to hear yourself again, to let your body soften, to live without constantly explaining your truth. Where forgiveness fits into your life is a personal decision, one that deserves time, consent, and safety. No one gets to decide that for you. If there's anything I hope you take from this episode, it's permission. Permission to move at your own pace. Permission to question what doesn't feel right. Permission to choose healing that doesn't require you to disappear. You don't owe forgiveness as proof of growth. You don't owe reconciliation as proof of love. You don't owe positivity as payment for what you survived. What you owe, if anything, is care for the self that carried you here. The self that adapted, the self that endured, the self that finally asked for something different. Sometimes that care looks like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like neither. What matters is that the choice is yours. Conversations about forgiveness, healing, and growth often come with an unspoken urgency, an expectation that insight should immediately lead to action, that clarity should produce a decision, that once something is named, it should be settled. But real healing doesn't always move on demand. Sometimes what follows recognition isn't relief, but a pause, a period of recalibration, a moment where your old ways of doing things fall away and nothing has fully replaced them yet. That in-between space can feel unsettling, especially in cultures and relationships that reward certainty, decisiveness, and closure. Not everything we uncover is meant to be acted on right away. Some realizations need time to settle into the body. Some questions need to stay open longer than we'd like. And some truths don't ask for movement at all, only acknowledgement. However forgiveness exists in your life, it doesn't need to resemble anyone else's. You're allowed to hold complexity without resolving it publicly. You're allowed to feel peace in one area and grief in another. You're allowed to want distance and still care deeply. None of those states cancel each other out. Healing is not a straight path forward toward virtue. It's an ongoing relationship with yourself, one that changes as you do. For some people listening, forgiveness may already be part of that relationship. For others, it may feel distant, confusing, or inappropriate right now. And for many, it exists in fragments, present in some places and absent in others. All of those experiences are valid. None of them require explanation. What I hope you take from this episode is a reminder that you're allowed to listen to yourself without rushing to align your feelings with what sounds spiritually mature, emotionally evolved, or socially acceptable. If you notice pressure, internal or external, to forgive, to reconcile, to stay positive, to move on, this may be an invitation to pause and ask whose comfort that pressure serves, and then use that information to help you stay anchored to yourself. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need it, and take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen. Your review helps more people find the podcast and reminds others they're not alone. Don't forget to subscribe or follow the show so you never miss an episode. You can also join me on Substack, where I share weekly reflections and gentle reminders to help you feel less alone on your healing journey. You'll find the link in the show notes. If you'd like to connect beyond the podcast, you can find me on Instagram. I'd love to hear what resonated with you. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a link there to buy me a coffee. And I'd like to give a heartfelt thank you to Molly for being one of the first supporters of the podcast on Buy Me a Coffee. Your support helps keep these conversations going, and I'm truly grateful. Thank you for being here, for listening with an open heart. Most of all, remember this: your story matters, your voice matters, and you are not alone. This episode was written and narrated by Irene Torres. Audio production by Carlos Torres. Original music composed by Carlos Torres.